good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Craft Education has put together an awesome panel of folks to talk to you about some shifting and how the government's strategy for funding apprenticeship and we're going to talk a little bit about why that is happening now, what those shifts mean, and how they can work better. There is a lot to unpack here, and I am excited to unpack it with this awesome panel. We're going to also save time for your questions today. So I see some of you are already dropping into the chat where you're joining us from. And please drop your questions as we go along, and we'll put them to our panel at the end. As I said, I can't imagine a better panel of experts to go through this today. So I'm going to step aside for a second and let them introduce themselves to you, starting with Mallory, with our lovely hosts at Craft Education. Mallory, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mallory Dwinall-Palish. I am the president of Craft Education and so excited to be here today. Okay, I think next is John, but should I share first, Nick, the one thing that I want to focus on today?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So for me, my focus today is going to be on what it means to demonstrate evidence for scalability and outcomes. And I think about that through two things, which is being employer centric and focused on financial sustainability through things like fund braiding and cost containment.
Great. Thanks, Mallory. John, over to you. And what's the one thing you're excited to talk about today about these new opportunities?
Sure. Hi, Nick. Hi, everybody. My name's John Ladd. I am Senior Advisor at JFF's Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning. I'm really excited to be joining everybody today. Prior to coming to Jobs for the Future, I served as the administrator for the Office of Apprenticeship, where we managed a lot of these funds and thought a lot about what is the best way to invest the annual appropriation for apprenticeship and what's going to have the biggest impact. So really excited to hear from this great panel, to hear from everybody that's joining today, and really talk about how this is an important piece of the puzzle, right? I think one of the things we really struggled with, during my time at DOL was, how do we create more demand on the employer side? How do we create that incentive for apprenticeship, which we always felt was a missing piece, and how to make that investment impactful and effective, similar to my other panelists here. So really excited to talk about how this is a piece of the puzzle to help growing and expanding registered apprenticeship across the U.S.
Thank you, John. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you and good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Jennifer Carlson, CEO and founder of Apprenti, registered tech apprenticeship initiative running nationally in the technology, AI, cybersecurity space. And I'm very excited to be here, but most specifically around the new levels of investment we're starting to see, and hopefully some consolidation around the number of resources that we braid from in order to get greater funding on a perpetual basis, more evergreen, and also be able to give some stability to the ecosystem for employers to rely on as a way of growing their engagement with registered apprenticeship. So excited to be here with the panel and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Jen. Amy, over to you, last but not least.
Oh, I froze for a second. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Lesniak. I founded One More Solution, apprenticeship consulting, after coming from higher education and workforce. I work with organizations large and small across multiple industries, anywhere they are in the full cycle of registered apprenticeship. I also help connect organizations with strategic partners and funding. So I was excited, and I am excited to talk about this funding announcement, especially the pay for performance aspect, what that means, because it's very different than the front-loaded funding I've seen before, and then the apprenticeship programs drop in practice, and also the fact that it's forecasted to only have 5 awards. So what does that mean for anybody who's trying to get in on this opportunity? What should you be thinking about? So I'm looking forward to discussing that here.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. I'm excited to talk with this group. If you don't know me, my name is Nick Beadle. I run the Jobs That Work newsletter, where we talk about workforce and the money that supports it. You can find my work and sign up for my newsletter by Googling Jobs That Work newsletter. I am also a veteran of the Department of Labor and its apprenticeship work, and most recently was the workforce chief of staff for the Good Jobs Initiative in the Biden-Harris administration. Over at Jobs That Work, one of the things I have been writing a lot about lately is the big plans that the Trump administration has for spending on pay per performance incentives. Earlier this month, the U.S. Department of Labor announced $145 million of these incentives to add more apprentices to fields like healthcare, information technology, and trade fields that are key to building the infrastructure needed to expand artificial intelligence. Now, just to help bring people along, and those who are not quite as versed in the ancient and powerful language of workforce ease, I sometimes call these pay to train incentives in my workforce newsletter. And that's because these dollars are meant to provide employers and apprentices, apprenticeship sponsors, financial payments that sort of incentivize them to make sure apprentices get hired, that they reach certain training milestones, and that they're retained. These incentives are definitely having a moment. Before the most recent announcement, DOL had awarded more than $100 million so far in the last 6 months to create these incentives, including a manufacturing fund that's operated by the state of Arkansas, which actually opened today. Industry leaders, including those in manufacturing, have called for these incentives to help incentivize employers who are reluctant to make the investments of time and money needed to create apprenticeship programs, even though the apprenticeship is a good answer for how they can fill open and skilled roles that they need filling. So, with all that in mind, this is a lot of money, and that's a lot to unpack. So, to start off our conversation today, I'm going to ask a question to our whole panel, which is why are these types of incentives having a moment? And from where you sit, what actually defines a good pay for apprenticeship program? And we will start off with John.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for that, level setting. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think I first want to start with, I agree that this is, a significant amount of funding, right? But in the grand scheme of things, right, particularly when you compare this level of funding to the amount of investment that we provide in education and other spaces, it really isn't a lot of money. I think what it is more of a big shift, right? It's a big shift in how the current funding is allocated, right? And if you just do the math here, and what we're seeing coming out of the Arkansas model, right? If this funding is to be used for incentives of about 3,500 per apprentice, right? We're talking about 40,000 new apprentices that this funding can support, which is a kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the $1 million goal that's being set up. So I think what you're seeing here is, a shift away from kind of, broad ecosystem funding to direct incentives to employers, right? And I think, as you mentioned, the Arkansas funds, other funds that came out over the summer, I think the administration is very much looking to provide funding directly to employers versus the broader ecosystem and intermediaries that might support those employers, and then kind of letting the market, play out. And those employers may choose to use some of that funding to, bring on an intermediary to help support the management of the program or develop the program. So I do think this is a big shift, right? And I think we're going to get into like, what are the key components of a good program. But when you look at the full 290, or so million federal appropriation for apprenticeship, this is kind of essentially replacing the grant strategy that DOL had been using with the Apprenticeship Build America grant. So again, I think this is consistent with what we've seen, which is let's put funding directly to employers, incentivize those employers to not just train, right, but we're incentivizing them to bring on apprentices, which is a much bigger decision than just training someone. As everyone knows with apprenticeship is a job. And so you're asking the employer to make a hiring decision that has long-term implications. And $3,500 is an important incentive and an encouragement to change their behavior and their hiring practices. But it's still a longer strategy that employer has to think about as to whether apprenticeship is the right solution to meet their talent needs today. So I think we can get into some of the other aspects of your question here in a minute, but I'll let my other panelists join in here as well. Oh, You're on mute, Nick.
That's my first unmute. Okay, so thank you, John. That was really helpful. And you mentioned intermediaries, and when I think of intermediaries, I think a lot of apprentice. Jennifer, sort of same question to you. Like, why are paper performance incentives kind of having this moment right now, and sort of what makes them a good one of these sort of programs work?
Uh, I think I think it's a philosophical conversation. I think historically, the investments that have been made to this point by the government have been in order to cultivate what has become the intermediary system. There wasn't, still to this day, isn't a formal definition of what an intermediary is and what it can do. Each of us does some common things, but each of us differentiates from there. The funding that's been provided has allowed the system to kind of work itself out, identify what works, how to get employers to engage, but it hasn't scaled. And I think that this shift is how do we get to that million plus? How do we get to 2 million plus? I mean, until we get an ecosystem where, 3 to 5% of the population writ large is engaging in an alternative track for a skilled career, i.e., apprenticeship, as it's a globally recognized system, we're still in an embryonic phase, but we've been in that embryonic phase now for 80 years. As we're trying to expand into these new traditional or non-traditional sectors, which are really the new sectors of evolution for employment, we're seeing employers try to figure out how to build talent at the same time that we're seeing employers figure out where to get or attract talent and how to screen for non-traditional. Like this is a huge culture shift that we're seeing. And then a piece of that culture shift equation is this funding structure. So now moving into pay for performance, now that we have an ecosystem of performing intermediaries that need to scale, I think this consolidation down in what we're seeing for this prospective new grant of, 3 to 5 intermediaries or 4 or 5 that they're going to fund to do this larger scope of work with a larger dollar attached to it is kind of a critical next step for scale. But I think I'll echo John that, compared to the cost in the marketplace of either creating the talent or for companies to invest in the infrastructure needed to support apprenticeship in the same way that they support their attraction of talent from the college system, that is going to take more time and more money. The pay for performance side of that means that the apprentices going into the system, as John said, apprenticeship is a job. If we're only being paid for those going into the system and not for the broader scope of work, then the employer incentive should work. If the barrier that we've been hearing from employers is a lack of consistency in funding. And so they can now do a longer term plan. The question now is what's the right number? And I think each industry sector has a different viewpoint on that. And this current system is kind of the first step into even seeing if this will work. I think intermediaries who have been working in this space are probably open to funding coming through a pay for performance model. It'll be challenging for smaller organizations. I don't think it's a perfect solution, but I think it's the next step in the evolution for us to learn from in order to help restructure it on a perpetual basis to make it more functional over time.
Yeah. And thank you, Jennifer, for that. And I think I want to bring in Amy here, and I know just kind of talk a little bit about provider readiness, or as we what do you think in turn, and put the same question to you, like why is pay performance having this moment now, and then sort of what will it take to sort of help make this work?
So I'm glad it's having this moment. I'm very optimistic. Kind of what Jennifer just mentioned. Usually when I talk about this, it's a culture shift when I'm talking to organizations about adopting apprenticeship, right? I have gotten funding through intermediaries for both employers and training providers, and we were paid on like how many people got registered, how many employer agreements did you sign, like on the paper. And then when it came to running the program, they would just stop. They already got the money. And so there was no completion, right? It's like in higher ed when they're like enrollment numbers up. Oh, quality and graduation goes down. So I'm working currently on another grant with a smaller employer that uses this model. And I have seen it improve retention. And it is a culture shift because it gets those middle managers and those mentors in the field, like everybody's accountable on every level through this. But it does work. Providers, if you're going to want to participate in this grant, you need your clearly defined outcomes and your baseline data. right? They're not funding pilot and exploration here, right? They want to show that you can do this and that we can scale it, right? So I'm hopeful that they're going to look a little closer on completion and wage increases and, the upskilling, the certifications, so that we can actually scale this, because I've been in this space for a little while and they've dumped money, at this initiative, and I haven't seen it scale appropriately. So hopefully this helps.
Thank you, Amy. Mallory, we'll wrap up this round with you. So same question. Why is it having this moment and what is it going to take for this to be successful? But also leaving off the point that Amy did, like, what's it going to take for us to scale? And by scale, I mean just sort of grow apprenticeship, which definitely is a priority of this administration.
First of all, I forgot to mention an apology for my background. I am displaced from the snowstorms, and so greetings from my in-laws' kitchen. So hence the background. But from there, Nick, I think the question you've just asked is two sides of the same coin of like, why is it having this moment now, and what is it going to take to scale? Those are actually, each one is in some ways an answer to the other, right? So the Biden or the Trump administration has made very clear through their executive mandate, their executive order earlier in 2025 around getting to 1 million apprentices, active apprentices. That is their North Star, right? That is what, when you talk to people in the current DOL, ETA, anyone radiating around that, it is very clear that that has been set as the tone. How we got here, I think there's a million different guesses, but that is where we are. That is the number that if you ask anyone in those departments, what do they care about? It's that. Today, we're at about 680,000 active apprentices. So they need to have a 50% growth, right? Take about half of what they've got and add that on again to hit that number in the very near term. And so they're not looking for onesies and twosies. They're not looking, to Amy's point, on inputs. They're looking for ROI. How are we finding in the industries they've identified as industries that they think are fast growing and critical? And there's about 6 of those that I think any applicant should pay attention to. How am I going to get massive numbers there? It's why this grant is structured as a larger grant, like a larger grant amount for a fewer number, only 5. It's why they're looking for collaboratives instead of a single applicant. They are looking for all of the market conditions to come together in a single application that give them as reviewers reason to believe we will make a significant dent in getting towards that gap of 320,000. And the last thing I'd say about that is kind of going back to John's opening point. When you do the math on that, $145 million towards 320,000, that gap, it's only about $200 per applicant or per apprentice they'd need. So they are not looking for direct one-to-one costs, right? It costs me this amount of money to train an apprentice, and so I'm going to ask for this amount of money to train that apprentice. They are looking for flywheel effects. They're looking for enabling conditions to create a market that will sustain itself in getting there. And that's going to be the name of this game. They are having a moment where this is all about accountability towards getting scaled outcomes.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mallory. And I appreciate you bringing this up because that 1 million number I know is especially key for the Department of Labor and the administration right now. And there have been some sort of pessimistic projections of that. I ran it through AI on my end. It produced 2032 was when they were going to hit it. Apprenticeships for America, who's a nonpartisan advocacy organization, did the same thing or did something similar, and they also came to 2032. So I think that sort of goes to our next question. And Amy, I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on this because you brought up a lot in terms of how you're able to shift these sort of conversations, which is this going to do what we want it to do? Because sort of to make a dent, if the goal is to sort of get to 1 million, it sounds like, the dollar amount may not necessarily get you there, but also if you want to make a dent in the 1 million, the question is, what does it look like? So I'm kind of curious to your thoughts of like how this can be set up to do what we wanted to do as a country and what the administration wants to do just in terms of its goals.
Going back to only 5 awards, right? They're looking for strategic partners, smaller employers that are already running a program. You need to be aligning with your, industry associations. That's something mentioned in the, forecast for this grant. Have your processes in place already. If you have successes or piloted the program, partner with intermediaries, partner with your industry associations so they can help strengthen what you can do. And then this grant, it's industry specific. So geographically, it really doesn't matter. Build a strong network. Um, you know, intermediaries provide great technical assistance, even though a lot of them aren't getting direct funding right now. They're all super helpful all the time. Be honest about the capacity you have, right? Don't come into this grant promising all these things when you don't have the technology behind it, the staffing behind it, whatever you need to do. Kind of evaluate where you are in your apprenticeship program, what you need to improve on, and what partners you need. And I think, for scaling in general, and especially this grant, I think, I can't say it enough, leaning heavily on those partners and looking at what you're able to do and scale can help, not only just starting with this funding initiative, but kind of the whole apprenticeship ecosystem as a whole. And everybody's kind of thinking about it the same way. How can we all work together to meet this goal? Yes, the funding is great and helps, but another important thing about funding like this, they want to see if you're still going to do it after the funding runs out from this grant.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amy. And actually, the goals of this and scale is something I want to chat about in a moment. But the one thing that's important to know here is that we only have a forecast in terms of what DOL's funding is going to be. There's currently grants.gov says this will be published tomorrow. We'll see where things end up. Obviously, there's a lot going on here in DC these days. But last week, while we were sort of prepping for this, Jennifer, you had a really interesting point about that I thought is kind of a question that is kind of left off the table, but something from having worked on these policies I think is really important. So, like, what are the types of features that could be here that might have sort of the opposite effect in terms of being able to expand capacity to grow apprentices? Because I thought you had a really great example of this last week.
Well, I think there are some pros and cons because this is an unproven system. Getting on a pay for performance basis means that they're paying for the outcome. Now, how that outcome gets measured is a different conversation. Hopefully, I saw a question in the thread about what data do people need to be gathering if you're not yet data ready. And I think it's really the income, meaning they have the job, they got the training necessary to be retained in the job, and what are they getting paid in that job? Because that's far more valuable than even having the standards registered. The next best piece to this is Vet Tech had done kind of a pay for performance in a way by doing a clawback requirement. So if your person got trained using vet tech dollars and then that person did not get placed into a job within 6 months of the completion of the related training, then that training provider would need to repay the government for every dollar that they took in training. Not because the VA is a great determiner of who's a successful training agent, but that provision of a clawback quickly identified who did good work based on the outcome of getting a job versus organizations that didn't. And several organizations had a clawback provision requirement that ended up putting them out of business. Now, that's both unfortunate because they may have done great training, but if you're going to leverage it through an apprenticeship and there isn't a job attached, we have a challenge. That may be a more painful way to do it, but there are methods out there that have already been tested by government that could be included in something like this or a version of this. And then you can look at California's model of paying in stages incrementally during the performance of the apprenticeship as a way to kind of slow the trickle of the money, but with a guarantee attached to it as opposed to if the money is still here, you'll get paid, which is the way they're doing it right now.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And I think that's important to note. And again, I'll say like we don't know what the features of this is going to be just quite yet. But
Right.
you mentioned the clawbacks. I know the Trump administration sort of golden age report, their workforce blueprint had mentioned a few times that they were interested in sort of reallocating money if someone had to hit performance marks. So I think that's
Mhm.
something very useful to keep in mind in terms of how this stuff has worked in the past. Speaking of sort of past apprenticeship efforts, John, we've talked a lot about paper performance, and we talked about like what it takes for us to be successful. But I'm kind of curious to just kind of get your thoughts as a former OA director, and I was in three administrations of both parties. We're definitely interested in growing apprenticeship in all of them. So, like, what will it take to make this work? And I think from your perspective, I'm kind of curious to hear about like how this would distinguish and how do you think this will grow or build upon the work that the department has done in the past around funding apprenticeship.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's been a great conversation so far. I mean, I do think, as Jennifer mentioned, it's kind of an evolution. I do think when we started, the first federal appropriation was back in 2016. There really wasn't much of a ecosystem, and there weren't many players in this space, and that's, really evolved over the past 10 years. So, I think part of what makes this, effort, that why this is important right now is, there have been so many more players coming into the system, and I think this is an opportunity to open up funding to a much larger group of players that really didn't exist 10 years ago. So, I think two things are really important in any of these efforts, right? I think everyone supports growing and expanding apprenticeship. We've had support over, three or four administrations broadly. What's different is the tactic and the strategy. And so we haven't had 10 years of a consistent approach. We've had kind of three or four sprints over 2 or 3 years of different tactics and approaches. And excuse me, I'm battling a cold here a little bit. I do think it's important that we have consistency and we have long-term certainty around what the strategy is. And I think it's important that it's a comprehensive approach, right? This is one piece of the puzzle. It's really trying to attack that demand side. But they're also funding states and they're growing the capacity of states. And that's really, really important because you can't just solve one part of the puzzle and leave other parts alone. We've got to look at this as an ecosystem, not just as a training strategy, and think about how do we grow and expand and support that broader ecosystem of which employers are at the center of it, but it is a broader ecosystem.
Thank you, John. And having been there, there's definitely been a lot of very different types of spaghetti thrown at this particular wall. So it's very interesting to kind of see this new strategy, and at least the consistency in the strategy is definitely a plus. So we're going, I think, kind of building off of this, and sort of we've heard a little bit about, how this could work, why this is happening now, as well as, what makes this exciting and where there's could be some drawbacks. I think the question a lot of our audience would have right now is if you're an employer, if you're a provider, if you're an intermediary, what should you be doing differently in the next 6 to 12 months? And I'm going to turn back to Amy because I kind of want to get your thoughts. Like, what do you think providers should be doing to make sure they are ready for this particular set of money? Because, and if nothing else, there's another 120, $130 million of DOL money for this year on apprenticeship that we don't know where it's going to go yet.
Yeah, so, from a provider perspective, you need to evaluate again where you are in the program, what you're defining as your outcomes and baseline data, for example. How are you measuring success in your program? Is it the wage progression, completion rates, the competencies, and your retention rates? Gather that data, look at how you're evaluating that, make sure you have that, presentable, because again, they're not funding exploration with this grant, right? you know, look at your program, see what you need to beef up. I mean, are you mostly just the training provider and then the mentorship and stuff falls on the employer? Do you provide wraparound services? Really take a hard look at your role as a provider or employer or however you fit into this. And think the data is most important to start with. Show that you're already running this program, that you also have the capacity. Does it mean you're investing in technology? Does it mean you have to hire an administrative support person to keep up with all the compliance tracking? And I know I went back to this earlier, but definitely look at your industry associations, reach out to intermediaries, find out other individuals in your industry that are interested in participating in this grant, right? So you need to show that you are ready to scale right now. And not everybody's going to be there, and for smaller employers, I think a risk of this could be the administrative burden and not knowing what you don't know. And that's why, again, the intermediaries, the industry partners, other employers in this space, there's a lot of resources out there, but just show that you are ready. You have a program in place, you understand where your shortfalls are, you understand clearly how you are measuring the outcomes, and then I think that'll set you up for success to be participate in this opportunity.
Thank you, Amy. And because I just saw it in the chat and we're at 2:30 right now, I did want to let folks know this recording will be, or a link to this recording will be finding its way to your inbox tomorrow, is my understanding. So just letting folks who may have to dart for that, for something else, acknowledging it's a busy day at the start of the year, letting you guys know. So building on what Amy was talking about, Jennifer, I want to turn back to you. Because I think Imprenti as an intermediary has a particularly very interesting perspective on this, particularly around employer adoption. So, in terms if I was if you're another provider, or hey, if you're someone who works with an employer, or heck, even if you are an employer, from your perspective, Jennifer, like what should you be doing differently in the next 6 to 12 months as this money starts to come online?
Well, from an employer perspective or the intermediaries?
Let's start with the intermediary, but I also am curious to your perspective because you've worked with a lot of employers and brought them into this business.
Yeah, I think from an intermediary side, it's something Mallory pointed out at the very beginning of this conversation, which is what is the opportunity cost and how are we covering it through these systems? And from an intermediary perspective, have you literally and figuratively figured out how to manage your overhead cost, the training or the RTI cost, to deliver this in a cost efficient way for employers? Hard stop. And then who's responsible for paying for that portion? Is this purely grant funded through state and federal governments and private philanthropy? Are the employers contributing to a part of this? The more stable we can get in the narrative around that for employer purposes, the better off we are. Several of the intermediaries are working together to try and figure out how to do that collaboratively so that because we each serve very different sectors, it's about how do we do this in a way that creates more cohesion in the marketplace for employers who are looking for one way to adopt this, but in a country that has 50 different systems or nuanced systems to apprenticeship. So the cost structure has to kind of get under control, and this funding is going to do a large step forward in consolidating the number of sources we have to go to do that. Now, on the employer side, similarly, we need employers to get themselves comfortable with a couple of things. Are they going to operate it internally or are they going to leverage an intermediary? That's a business decision. Even if they're going to leverage an intermediary, this funding can be used or ported directly back to the employer. So it doesn't mean that the dollar stops with whichever entity is doing the registration. That's between the intermediary and the employer to set up. The employers need to advance the conversation about how are we going to create more talent because we know that the higher education system has its limits. And how are we going to create kind of the other side of the coin? We know how to recruit talent from internships in universities. We are not good at creating the other side of the talent, which are apprentices, but it's really two sides of the same coin. One has the theory and the other has the hands-on, and they each need to mentor each other. But that means that it's part of the cohesive ecosystem that employers need to think about how do they integrate that inside their organization and on what roles and occupations. And I would argue that any job that's been posted or takes you longer than 3 months to fill is a job you should be doing as an apprenticeship. Hard stop. Doesn't matter what industry, sector, type, or title. That is part of that culture shift that we were starting this conversation with at the beginning.
Thank you for that, Jennifer, and definitely sort of getting employers to sort of see where they can go and how they can use apprenticeship is definitely a very useful tool in all this and something that's kind of one of the big questions in a lot of how you expand apprenticeship. I want to turn back to you, Mallory, with our lovely host at Craft. Sort of same question to you, in terms of being prepared over the next 6 to 12 months. But I'm kind of curious about your thoughts in terms of if I'm, a provider or employer looking to build partnerships, if I'm designing the funding, what should I be doing and how should I be thinking and prepping right now?
I think it all comes down to ROI for the employer, right? So that is, and my theory of the case here is the way in which you get that scale that the administration is looking for is by having this be something that makes good business sense to employers. They have to be at the center of it. This has to be an ROI question for them. And we think about what that ROI is, it comes back to what Jennifer said of like, there is a pain of not being able to find the talent you need, right? There is a cost to that. And the degree to which you can get them a benefit that offsets that cost that is greater than what it is costing them to work with you, that's how you're going to get employers to adopt. Now, I think it's very easy to talk about cost in terms of the actual dollar cost on this. What's our cost of tuition? How long does it take these people to get trained? How likely are they to be ready? But there's also these non-dollar costs that I think RTI providers and intermediaries should be thinking about of what makes an employer feel like this is worth my time or not. And I'll just give one example that I saw time and time again when I was working in the teacher apprenticeship space, but it's a universal problem, is RTI providers would have training requirements that were in the middle of the workday and completely blew up the cost to the school district, to the employer on I now have to have this person who is responsible for supervising students, even if they weren't teaching them, they were an adult in the room, to leave the building for 2 to 3 days a week, be completely unavailable. And now I have to find new staffing structures. Well, that fundamentally limits how many of those people an employer can put through that program, even if they believe in it. Getting rid of that by having the programming be online, by having it happen on weekends so it wasn't interflicting or conflicting with the workday, suddenly these same employers were willing to 10x the number of people they were willing to train. So again, I think the central thesis of what you should be doing to get ready is by really doing empathy work with your employers. What are the pain points for them that they need solved? And what are the pain points that you might be unintentionally creating unnecessarily as you try to solve those problems? Whether that's financial or in terms of scheduling, credit for work, all of the things that weigh into an employer shifting away from, this is a hassle that I'm supposed to do, to this is a good business solution that I need and I'm going to pull in at scale. The more time you spend thinking about and solving those problems so that those employers are excited about this, they want to endorse this, and then they actually do want to move on the other side of that endorsement with you, that's the best use of your time right now.
Thank you, Mallory. We have a couple of minutes here before we're going to turn over to reader questions. But Mallory, I want to stick with you here for a quick lightning round. If I am employer, if I'm someone who feels like I want to tap in this money, I want to be ready for to do it for tomorrow. Like, what does ready to scale mean? Because there's a lot of emphasis just in this funding forecast on scaling to apprentices, and as you mentioned earlier, they're aiming for 1 million. So, like, if you're trying to do bulk, like, what does that mean? And does that differ from some of the stuff you just talked about?
If you are an employer, there are two things that I think about. One is identifying the pathways. So, a lot of times, the easiest way to get started with apprenticeships isn't to create a fundamentally new role. It's in nursing to take a look at, hey, I have all of these certified nursing assistants that I could upskill and apprentice into being registered nurses, right? If you're working in any profession, there's that entry level role that you could quickly upskill. What are those pathways that exist in your industry that could quickly take the talent you already have and convert them from A to B? A lot of times in the apprenticeship world, in the workforce world, we think about incumbent worker training and apprenticeship as two completely different things. And that's foolishness, right? So that's the first thing is identifying those pathways that you already could potentially have in place. The second thing is thinking about your data infrastructure. To your point, Nick, if you're doing this for onesies and twosies, pencil and paper is fine. If you're talking about doing this for 1 or 2 thousand, not so much. Again, Craft is here as a free nonprofit public data utility to offer that free data infrastructure to get groups from A to B. So, of course, that's what I think about when you're holding a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. But I genuinely don't know how you think about getting the numbers to be interesting in this application or to this administration more broadly. If you're trying to manually handle pencil and paper systems, you've got to have tech infrastructure in place to do this work. And there are good free options out there to help you with that.
Yeah, thank you, Mallory. And I can tell you from having been inside the Department of Labor, paper records have been one of the great thwarters of apprenticeship growth over time. So that's definitely a fantastic point to make here. Jennifer, I want to turn it over to you. Just going to ask you the same question in terms of like from your perspective, having been an intermediary, like what does ready to scale mean to be able to do more than those sort of onesies and twosies to still align from Mallory here?
Well, the onesie and twosies, I also think are split between small and mid-size versus enterprise. Getting more companies thinking through a lens and the industry, like all of the component parts working together better, will help it scale. So going back to, even though there's only going to be a handful awarded, doesn't mean there won't be serious cross collaboration between the delivery agents, meaning the training providers, community-based organizations, employers, et cetera. When you put it all together, the delivery model, right now there isn't a definition of each component in law, and so it's funding apprenticeship writ large. I would suggest that the preparedness is have your training providers lined up. A lot of these employers have been doing what I call corporate social responsibility hiring, with a lot of intermediaries and small organizations, community-based organizations. And it's hit a point of being unwieldy. And they are, in many cases, going full circle, and moving from local and regional delivery or decision making to more centralized decision making in large enterprise companies because of that. And if the collective can come together without naming a name, a perfect example is a large financial services organization that has had local based discussions and decision making, trying to get them to see that they can continue to engage with 30, 40, 50 different training providers at the local level if apprenticeship is the onboarding methodology to standardize how they get delivered and onboarded into the company. Thinking differently about this is how we're going to get to scale, because we are each in some way cannibalizing each other. If one organization is getting five, we're getting five, and three others are getting five. It's really 25 that should be going through apprenticeship, period. And we can help to integrate and thread them all into one onboarding system and still maintain the benefit of the ecosystem and diversity of the training advisors or those who are doing the training work in the field, can still be a broad ecosystem. That's, I think, one of the fastest ways to get to scale. And your preparedness is your ability to collaborate across all of those partners in the ecosystem, delivering a piece of the equation.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think, I know just to save some time for our questions, I'm going to put this question to one last person. And Amy, you get the most lightning of lightning round sort of bits of time here. So again, like what you just sort of what does Richard Ready to Scale mean here, in just a few sentences?
All right. Well, kind of what I said before, what Jennifer just mentioned. Be honest with what your capacity is, what your strengths are, have your data ready to go, and start aligning your partners, whether that's other employers, training providers. I do think one thing to consider about this grant also is employers run on production schedules, not grant timeline schedules, right? So aligning what employer will see as the ROI, what they see as return on their investment, not, handed them some grant outcomes because then they're going to disengage.
And Nick, can I jump on that just a little
Please.
bit? Because I think Amy really, crystallized that well. I really do think people need to think about like what role they want to play and think about what their capacity is. Because I, I think in some cases, folks are thinking about this fund a little bit wrong, that it's only going to benefit, the entities that might win the grant and, the partners that they work with. I mean, this particular cooperative agreement is going to be for someone to operate a payment management system, right? It's going to be something that's widely available to the broader system, whether you're the administrator of the fund or not. So I think we all need to be thinking about how do we access this new resource and how does this new resource fit into that broader array of resources that we're braiding to support employers, effort to stand up these programs. So again, this isn't just a benefit to the individual organizations that might be successful in operating this fund, but it's meant to be a broader support for the broader ecosystem.
Thank you for that, John. All right, we're going to turn to your questions now. We've gotten a fair number of them in here. The one thing I do want to specify here is that, and just to avoid any confusion, this grant is still not quite posted yet, and so we don't know necessarily in terms of whether pre-apprenticeship is involved or other things like that may necessarily sort of tweak how many is there. But we do know the administration's big priority, as Marilee talked about, is getting that 1 million apprentices number. So I think the first thing I'm going to sort of start off with to kind of ask people, which is, first of all, like let's start a little bit more about the sort of put to the group a sort of broader question, which is, how does this differ, I think, in a fundamental way if you've taken part in sort of these grant structures in the past that say we put out that OA put out under you, John, or that have been put out by DOL in the earlier frame of the second Trump administration. So, John, this is I think is a great question for you
Yeah.
to start off with, like what is the big difference here in terms of what was being done before and then what's being done now?
Yeah, so I think this is the key question, right? And there's a key phrase in the forecast, which, again, I kind of touched on a little bit earlier, this idea of, you need to demonstrate how you're going to operate a payment management system, right? This is very different than what has been funded before, which, could support a wider array of services, include pre-apprenticeship to apprenticeship. My expectation is that this award will be for an entity to provide these, incentive payments directly to employers without a lot of wraparound supports. I think some of that work will be done by the other, the RFI that came out earlier, where they are looking for more traditional intermediaries. But this is going to be very much a replication of what you see in Arkansas, which is, a payment system to employers to create that incentive and demand. So the devil will be in the details, right? I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned by what is in the final notice, but it's likely to be very lean without a lot of administrative, funding attached to it, and be primarily focused on issuing payments. So, again, this is very different than some of the funding that's come out from DOL before, which had much more kind of a, wrap around capacity. You're building up capacity of organizations to provide a broader array of services, allowing grantees to bring partnerships together to create pipelines from pre-apprenticeship to apprenticeship and maybe even degree apprenticeships. This is going to be much more singularly focused on making incentive payments. So again, it goes back to what folks have said earlier. Really think about, is that the role that your organization wants to play? Do you have the capacity to do that? Or do you want the ability to access that fund for the employers and other partners that you work with? And my sense would be similar to, again, Arkansas, that fund will be available to anybody in that particular sector. And the entities that are running these accounts are going to want to open it up because they're going to have their performance goals that they want to reach that they're not necessarily going to be able to get to on their own. So again, very different than what's been offered before by DOL.
Thank you, John, for that. I want to bring in sort of a more provider or more sort of build program builder sort of perspective on that. Amy, Mallory, just sort of thinking functionally from grants like Apprenticeship Building America or the state apprenticeship grants. Like, how do you see this being sort of fun, being different if I'm familiar with those programs, and like how should I be shifting my mindset if I'm a provider?
I've worked with state grants, been part of a regional consortium for bigger federal grants and things like that. And so for this, because they're focused on getting the incentive payment to the employers, it's been the age-old problem in apprenticeship, right? How do we get the employers on board? So, if this really succeeds in putting most of the money to incentivize the employers, I'm uh, and more, the bigger grants, there's always a piece written in for administrative and this and that. And then when it comes down to the employer, they're not getting their ROI on this. They're still like, this is so much work, right? So whatever we can do to tailor, the operational aspect of this to benefit the employers, because I've worked with employers who opt out of funding because they don't want to deal with the administrative burden or any other paperwork that goes with it, right? So I think we need to be really cognizant of being employer focused, not only monetarily, but how is this, going to make their lives easier and enhance their training program? Because all the employers want retention. So I think just kind of thinking of it from an employer perspective, and then shifting that from, the other traditional grant models where a lot of that money gets allocated to outside administrative costs.
I
Yeah.
would just add to what Amy said of, we don't know, right? So I can't say this is what is different because it hasn't been released yet. It's targeted to be released tomorrow, that though no one knows what the continuing resolution uncertainty will mean for that. But here's would be my prediction and what it will mean in terms of what's different. To date, most grants across administrations have been sort of fixed input, and you were given funding for delivering against those inputs, which people you were working with, what activities you were going to deliver. That was all sort of set in advance, and then it was your job to go execute it. I suspect, given the posture of this grant and then what we've seen come out so far, that this will be much more focused on flexibility on the inputs, but like very fixed pay for performance on the outcomes. Now, what that means is, I see questions in the chat around, does this mean there's no money for TA? Does this mean that they won't be funding this or that? I actually suspect that there'll be a lot of agnosticism to that. Groups will get grants by being able to say, we have the coordinating conditions to get you these systems level outcomes, to get you thousands of apprentices. And that then they will have a ton of flexibility regardless of who submits a letter of support in their application for which employers they work with, for what services they're providing to get there. So long as, I mean, it's a federal grant, so there will always be constraints, but what they will really be held accountable to won't be their inputs, it'll be the number of people they're getting trained on the other side. And so, what that means to me is even if you're not someone who is a good fit for being a lead on this application and there's not a good spot to sit in, I would track who the awardees are. And if you see them come out saying, we've committed to build this many people in this industry and you provide technical assistance in that industry, reach out to them and see if there's a way for you to be a subcontractor or a vendor that they pay to do that work. Because I don't think it's going to be as rigid on what the inputs are. It's going to be about whoever gets these grants, what they think it's going to take for them to get to those numbers they're going to be held accountable for on outputs.
Thank you, Mallory. And I think the thing I'm going to turn to the group, some question I've seen a few times, and I know it's the million-dollar question I've heard asked a lot from people all over apprenticeship and all over politics the last couple of months, which is this going to work in terms of getting to a large number of apprentices? So I think I will put this to the panel because, I think I heard someone balk once at 10,000 new apprentices, which is massive, that one of the programs could do. So like, I'm kind of curious, like, does this going to significantly add new numbers of apprentices? And I'll just toss that to the whole panel real quick.
Magic answer, maybe.
Excellent lawyer answer, by the way.
I think they'll be, to your point, this is going to be more flexible than we've seen in the past. And original funding was on the top of the funnel. How do we build more programs and get things going? This is the opposite end of that spectrum. And I agree with Mallory. This is about the outcome. We're going to track, did you get the body in and did they stick? Is there a middle ground someday? Maybe, but I think there's going to be room for a lot of testing at the other end of that funnel in this funding. And I think we have to address the fact that the sectors are going to come up with variable outcomes because no two sectors operates identically. That registration will be the requirement. And then it's, how the funding gets allocated and distributed will be up to whomever wins it. And they could approach it on a sectoral basis, or they could approach it on a company by company basis, or some combination therein. And that's going to dictate through competency the outcomes and which ones work and which ones don't. So, we're further along in the testing process from where this started 10 years ago, but I think we pointed out that there was a shift in the Arkansas funding to focus more on existing programs than on net new creation of programs, which means that in order to scale, I think you're going to see something similar. It's going to require systems that are already up and operational. That doesn't mean that new can't get funded. It just means, to your point, they're going to be subs. And that makes it viable for somebody to do one versus 1,000. And it makes it easier to manage those.
I'll say I'm a cautious yes, right? And the reason that I'm a little more optimistic is as a general philosophy, I think what gets measured gets managed, right? And if you are measuring people, like if you are measuring programs and holding them accountable to producing more apprentices, and that's what you're measuring instead of who they worked with, internal inputs and milestones, that will be what gets managed and we'll see those results. The reason I'm cautious as opposed to emphatic is I do think there is a miss here of focusing the industries in on the seven that they've chosen, and keeping it, as far as we know, pretty limited to that. While there is growth across all of those economies, I'm not sure it's to the scale that's going to get to the hundreds of thousands order of magnitude that this administration is looking for. And I think a big oversight that I hope they will consider either in this or in, as has been raised, if and as there are future SAFE 4 and SAFE 5 grants. No one knows if those are planning on being replaced right now or not, but is other sectors like the care economy, right? So healthcare is in there, yes, but sectors like teaching, social work, early childhood education, we're seeing a lot of statistics suggest that we will need a huge growing population in those sectors. They're perfect for apprenticeships. I think it's an interesting miss that makes me a little more pessimistic on if we'll hit our numbers, that those aren't eligible for this as far as we know right now. But I think in general, what gets measured gets managed, and they're headed in the right direction by going for those numbers.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I do want to say, and John, I saw you pop in here and kind of curious to get your answer on that. Like, Jen had mentioned something that's kind of come up in Arkansas where it's largely favoring existing programs. There's actually not as many existing manufacturing apprenticeship programs as you might think. Like
Hmm.
some states have 67 apprentices based on DOL's numbers. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of curious your thought as a former OA director. Like, is this going to work?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can, right? And I think it will depend on being strategic, because the money is so limited, right? I think the big question is, are we creating an expectation now that for every apprentice that gets registered, that there's an expectation that there's going to be an incentive payment that should go with that person, right? And we've been doing this so far really without a lot of incentives other than in the construction industry. But if you want to get to 1 million apprentices and every apprentice has an incentive payment attached to them, that's about $3.5 billion, right? That would be needed to support this kind of approach. So I think if you do target those industries where there isn't much penetration, I think if you do focus on those larger, even national programs or multi-employer programs, I know we want to support small and medium-sized employers too, but I think if you have a limited pot, you really have to make some tough choices and be strategic about where you're going to have the most impact. So, I think if you can be strategic and really target specific sectors for growth, I think it can work.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to transition. I have a lot of friends from Craft share a little bit with us here at the end of this panel. But I do want to put one last question that I thought was fantastic in there. Just one sentence, if I can challenge some people who know how to cook when they're asked a question to answer in one question, which is if you are brand new and a little lost today, what is one thing that you should be doing to kind of get a step to take advantage of this money? And thank Mallory. I'll turn it over to you to lead off with that.
Well, I think you should put me last because it's about to be pay attention to what comes on the next slide. So I'll pause there, which is get in touch with us. We are a free tool that exists to help you do exactly that. So why don't I just say that as my preview and pass it over to Jennifer?
Yeah, sounds great.
Thanks. I think if you're looking to get into this space, and we've had a couple of people ask the question, what do they do? I think seeking out any of the intermediaries for technical assistance to give you some insight about the pros and cons of going at it on your own versus using a third party. And there is nothing that says you can't start with an intermediary to get it set up, and then over time move it in-house as you've built the infrastructure.
Amy, over to you.
I was going to say reach out to any one of us on this panel because we can help.
Yeah.
John, I want to try to hold you to one sentence. What
Yeah,
can we
I,
do?
I, I would echo that, but I would say look deeply at what your core strength is, and does this align with that core strength, and what role do you want to play moving forward? But there's definitely a role for everybody in this broader ecosystem, and as everybody said, feel free to reach out, and lots of folks here are willing to share their time and their expertise.
I'll count that as a run-on sentence. All right. Mallory, I think I will turn it back over to you and our crafty friends to talk about craft education.
Great. And actually, I think the slide that I would love is the one after this. So, Scott, is there anything you want to say? Yep, there we go. So, if you need help with any of this, again, Craft is a free nonprofit public data utility. Our goal is to get more groups into this space. So, if you need help, you can reach out to Robert Owens, whose email you see at the bottom here. You should also just follow along the work that Craft posts publicly. We make sure that we are doing a scan of grants coming out across all 50 states and the federal government and are posting that to our channel for anyone to follow. So a huge shout out to Robert for pulling all of that together and making sure those informations are publicly available. Reach out to him and or follow us on LinkedIn and other social media. Going to the next one. The other thing you can do is we have another webinar coming up in February right now that is actually very much related to this. To all my workforce board friends out there that are watching this, we think that you are the lifeblood and the engine that pushes a lot of this forward. And one of the other things we're working to do is demystify what that system is for employers, for intermediaries who might live squarely in apprenticeship and not touch that space, et cetera. So if you are interested in finding resources beyond just this grant, register now with the QR code you see on the screen, or go to crafteducation.com/WDB dash webinar so that you can learn more about that piece of this ecosystem. I realize I spoke quickly on that, but I want to be punctual. That's the bottom line from me. I think we're ready to close this thing out if you go to the very last slide in this deck. And just a huge thank you. Thank you, Nick, for taking the time to convene us all here today. Thank you for everyone for joining in and for the work you're doing in this space. I see a question from Keith in the chat. I will close on this funny note as we wrap up of if I know a guy named John Palish. I do well. And so I'm currently sitting in Kentucky. Here's a fun fact for everyone. I'm in no way related to John Palish. Our names are spelled differently. But Kentucky is a small world, and the odds on bet that he and my husband somewhere 100 years ago did come from the same clan, which reinforces every stereotype people have about us here. So there you go. I do not know. I know John, not because we're related, but he is another super knowledgeable person in this space you should chat with.
I'm
And I
from
see your
Alabama. I'm not going to make a Kentucky joke, I promise.
Thank you very much. Leave us be. I saw one more question here. If we could go back to the slide that has Robert Owen's email in particular. So you can either go to info@craft.com or at crafteducation.com or robert.owens@crafteducation.com. And I guess we'll just leave this slide up so that people know how to get a hold of us. And with that, we're ready to close. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I will add one real quick. A lot of what we're talking about today, including some shifts into that Arkansas apprenticeship fund, I'll be covering over at Jobs That Work tomorrow. And you can find me by Googling Jobs That Work newsletter. And happy to have your readership and happy to talk to everyone today. Thank y'all.
Thanks, everyone.